1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm deaf. I haven't.
There's noise coming out for your words.
That's what my wife says too. There's noise coming out.
Turn it off. We can still hear you.
She says the same thing too.
Yeah, the difference is we can't.
Good morning, everybody.
Bass players. Turn it. There's something wrong. I can hear your bass. I love the bass.
Boom, 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 boom. Just because the clock says it's earlier doesn't mean you're early.
It was so weird, we're getting up this morning and started doghouse. Well, thank goodness for automatic clocks these
Yes.
days, because
Yes.
I forgot to turn in the Evelyn's back.
Well,
My clock should be set on.
we had Alexis at the alarm, so I was convinced that that would automatically change. And
Yeah.
yeah, then I didn't want to get up. Jim, would you open this morning for me? Would you open this morning for me? I have a friend whose son, who is 14, will soon have to have his second Achilles tendon lengthening surgery. So if you'll add him, his name is KK. KK. Actually, his mother is from Oahu, and so he has a Polynesian name, and rather than abuse the name, he just goes by KK. So. KK. And of course, Mila.
And Tommy is sick too.
Tommy is sick too.
Jerry can't make it today. She still doesn't feel strong enough in her legs. And
And who?
Andy.
Andy?
Andrew McNair.
Oh, Andy McNailer. And
Still recovering her knee.
yeah, I understand knees are a whole lot worse than hips. So. Anybody else? Okay. Go ahead, Jim.
Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we praise your holy name as the Holy One, the creator of the world, our master, the grantor of our hope and peace. We praise you for your mercy and grace to us and your blessing of salvation. Heavenly Father, help us as we study your word. Help us to incorporate it in our lives. Help us to be good students of the word. Heavenly Father, we pray for KK. We pray for Mila and Tommy, for Andrea. We pray for Randy Curtis, Barbara Cavalier, and others that need your help. Lord, bless them. Give them strength as they approach their particular illnesses and grant them recovery. Heavenly Father, help us to be your people. Help us to support each other and to learn to live in fellowship with each other. It's in Christ's name we pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Well, I appreciate you all remembering to move your clocks forward this morning to be here. So we're going to get right into this because there's a whole bunch here. I did want to make a side note. We had a little fun with this last week, but we are 2/3 of the way through Isaiah. Yeah. So. Which year? It really is a blessing. There's so much in this book. at times you feel like you're dragging along, it's taking forever, but with the volume of inspiration that's in here, it's really hard to go much faster, so, and do it any kind of justice. So we're in chapter 42 still, this morning. We're going to pick up in the middle of the chapter, beginning in verse 16. Last week we talked about the conqueror, the picture of the conqueror that's painted in verses 13 through 15, and why the Jews could easily have looked for a physical king again. So 16 through 23 brings back up a subject that we talked about a couple weeks ago that we got into at length, and that is the blindness, or the metaphor of blindness. And so I'm going to read 16 through 23, and then we're going to go back and we're going to talk about it. And I will lead the blind by a way they do not know. In paths they do not know, I will guide them. I will make darkness into light before them, and rugged places into plains. These are the things I will do, and I will not leave them undone. They shall be turned back and utterly put to shame, who trust in idols, who say to molten images, you are our gods. Hear, you deaf, and look, you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant, or so deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is so blind as he that is at peace with me, or so blind as the servant of the Lord? You have seen many things, but you do not observe them. Your ears are open, but none hears. The Lord was pleased for his righteousness' sake to make the law great and glorious. But this is a people plundered and despoiled. All of them are trapped in caves or are hidden away in prisons. They have become a prey with none to deliver them, and a spoil with none to say, give them back. Who among you will give ear to this? Who will give heed and listen hereafter? Okay. The first thing I want to touch on is a conversation that Jason and I had, and it had to do with how God is described. And Jason, would you mind repeating that, how God is represented in respect to this? Thank you. Now, what's interesting is two of those provide what? Two of those representations provide what? Light in some form, don't they? A fire provides light. So it really shouldn't be that big of a surprise that we see this concept of blindness being applied so much, because blindness represents what? Complete darkness. And so God would then represent what? The exact opposite of that. Okay, so it was just kind of something that occurred to me after our conversation, Jason, and some more study, that this picture is really painted very beautifully. In this passage, who are the blind? So who would that be in this context?
Those who depend on God.
I'm sorry?
Those who depend on God.
Generally speaking, I agree. I think in this passage, though, it's a little more specific. And I think we have biblical proof for it. For the Israelites, yeah. Okay. There's a couple things here that kind of tend towards that. Where did I see it here? When it talks about the blind in a path they do not know, in paths I will guide them, I will make darkness into light before them. But what I found was interesting was a cross-reference. Y'all turn to Matthew 13. We're going to start in verse 12. These are the words of Jesus. Whoever has will be given more, and will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing they do not see, though hearing they do not hear or understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled. You will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. So I think Jesus tells us that Isaiah is talking about the Jews. We see one other cross-reference. Flip over to Romans 2. Paul is one of my favorite characters in the New Testament. He, by a long stretch, he's not perfect. It was never perfect, but boldness at a level that we could only hope to get close to. Chapter 2, beginning in verse 20. An instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. You then who teach others, do not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Who was Paul speaking to? Speaking to the Jews. He's speaking to his people. Okay? So we see that if we go back into this context, that's what this is coming from. So if you keep that in mind as we go to the end of the chapter, and then like I gave a little bit of a foremention last week, I have some comments from Clark that I found really interesting. So, okay, verse 23 through 25 is another reminder, and Isaiah is great for this, is another reminder of exactly who's in charge. So we're back in Isaiah 42. Beginning in verse 23. Who among you will give ear to this? Who will give heed and listen thereafter? Who gave Jacob up for spoil and Israel to plunderers? Was it not the Lord against whom we have sinned? And in whose ways were not willing to walk, and whose law they did not obey? So he poured out on them the heat of his anger and the fierceness of battle, and it set him aflame all around. Yet he did not recognize it, and it burned him, but he paid no attention. Okay. Who's in this context? The Israelites. Okay. So obviously when it says, who gave Jacob up for spoil, that's a reference to God. Again, making sure that everybody knows who's in charge. Who's responsible for their circumstances? They are. Why? They sinned. How did they sin? Generally. Idolatry was the number one cause. And probably most of their other problems came about from that idolatry. Okay. It's an interesting footnote in verse 24. Again, going back to Bible Hub with the 31 translations. 29 of those 31 translations read, we have sinned, using the first person, which is what's in my version here. There's a couple others, the Breton Septuagint and the Contemporary English. The Septuagint says they have sinned, and the Contemporary English read Israel sinned in the third person. And I just thought that was kind of interesting that the grammatical structure changes. Doesn't change the context, doesn't change the meaning, but to choose third person instead of first person I thought was interesting. So it's almost as if to create some arm's distance.
It's interesting here, when you think about these ancient times, I'm at this nation, I have God A, and I go and I attack your nation B, and I defeat you, my God is more powerful than yours.
Yeah.
But here, when we read these things, we have to realize God lets his people get defeated, but he also brings them out. And he warned them that's going to happen. But no other false gods ever make that kind of claim.
No. No.
I love the story of when they took the articles of worship to before Baal or the statue, and it falls down on its face in front of it.
Dagon.
Dagon, that was it. Thank you. I couldn't remember the name. I love that story.
We're going to see more of that in the next chapter, actually.
Yeah, that's a very funny story. Also shows how God has a sense of humor.
I think this all really speaks to the lost too, just plain to all of the lost.
This passage?
See, but don't, you know, you hear, but
When we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, yeah, I think that it was aimed more in a broader spectrum. I think this kind of narrows it back down. It's the same basic message, and yes, it does apply to everyone, but I think in this context, it's really aimed at the Jews themselves. So when you look at that whole context, and then when you see the words of Jesus that come back and clarify that that's exactly who Isaiah was speaking of. So I want to read these notes here from Clark. For those of you that don't know, I meant to find out when exactly he lived. He did an entire expository on the whole Bible, a verse-by-verse breakdown, most of the time with the original language that's in it, a lot of commentary, a lot of cross-references, to other translations, really some in-depth study. Again, not to say that his is perfect either, but there's a wealth of information in there. And I have never seen these comments as long as I've been using his commentary. And it's in reference to this chapter, and especially the last two verses of the chapter. The fury of his anger, the heat of his wrath. He cites a Hebrew word, chama, I believe. It hath set him on fire round about. Here's his commentary. So thoroughly hardened are the Jewish people that they are represented as being in a house on fire and even scorched with the flames without perceiving their danger or feeling that they are hurt. What a picture of mental induration. And this is their state to the present day. But by whom shall Jacob arise? For in this sense he is small indeed. Many efforts have been made to Christianize them, but without effect. And this is to be wondered at. While we tell them how great they are, how learned, how wise, how much we owe to them, that they are still a peculiar people of God, if all this to be true, what can they gain by becoming Christians? Whereas a more stupid, proud, hardened, ignorant people can scarcely be found in the civilized world, and they are most grossly ignorant of their own scriptures. He did not. A little harsh, but very accurate. Very accurate. Who had more access to the scriptures than the Jews? So, and they had Jesus to tell them that this is what those scriptures meant. So,
I think we're kind of modeling that now, though.
we are, yeah. I thought the same thing about as I originally read through that.
100 or so years ago it was different, but not so much anymore today.
Yeah.
And especially if you go to other countries, there's a lot of countries, especially in Europe.
You mean like California?
We won't go there, but that are post-Christian.
Yeah.
Literally, they completely abandon.
Yeah. Tim? Thank you. Okay, so 1762 to 1832, he would have been writing this right as this country began. So that helps some with his context as well. So, interesting. I appreciate that. Okay. Any last comments on 42? Oh, I did have one more comment that I forgot to see here. When I read Clark's comments there, excuse me, that almost seems to be the same level of frustration that God shows towards the Jews so many times. Is the same, what the frustration that was in Clark's comments there, mimic God's frustration with the Jews so many times. We saw that in a couple chapters earlier where I cross-referenced back to Job, and God just comes out and says, where were you all? So, let us hope that we never get on that level of frustration from God. Yeah. Yep. How do we? Okay. How else? We study. How else? We share. How else? Yeah, that would be a welcome change for all of us, wouldn't it? For us to listen. There's one other thing we're missing. Obey. One other thing we're still missing. How about prayer? And all of the other things. No? Yeah. I see Melanie left. Okay. And that's what he talks about in here. Those that have eyes but don't see, those that have ears that don't hear. Exactly what you're talking about, the difference. All right. Let's go ahead and get into 43. Chapter 43 is a lot more uplifting, all in all. It starts off with a reminder to the Jews to whom they belong. And so let's start with verses 1 through 3. But now, thus says the Lord, your Creator, O Jacob, and He who formed you, O Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they will not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched, nor will the flame burn you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I have given Egypt as your ransom, Cush and Seba in your place. So this actually gets back to what we were talking about, is that God punished them and always brought them back. And that's the beginning of the context for this chapter. When God calls Jacob Israel, what is he really calling them? When he uses that language. Yeah, and he's doing it, what's interesting, is he's doing it the same way that our culture has a marriage. When a couple gets married, it is our culture, doesn't always happen because we have people, just not a fan, but our culture says what? Well, yeah. Doesn't the woman take the husband's name in our culture? That's the same concept that's here, is that Israel is being called by God's name. That's the power that's in here. So, you wonder where some of our cultural things come from? You only need to look back to the scriptures. These things of in the marriage ceremony, a man and woman becoming one, the woman taking the name of the husband, all of these things. This is where they have their roots, is in the scriptures. And God's relationship with us and with his people in Israel and with his church, all the way through. So, yeah. 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 That's not unlike a parent, huh? When one of our children reminds us of us when we were children, we usually have a very strong rebuke, but nonetheless, they're still our child, and we still bring them back into the fold. And having raised 5 sons, that happened more than once. And I'm not sure which was worse, their actions or the fact that they reminded me of my actions. Anyway, verse 3. Many of the commentators think that verse 3 refers to Sennacherib and the divine intervention that redirected him away from Israel and towards Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Sabaeans. And we find also that Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sabia rose up together to wage war against the Assyrians. So that's where several of them think that this applies. It could just as easily refer us to a more general term of the nations that God sacrificed to develop and protect Israel. And if we go back through, we can go back to Abraham with the 5 kings that he waged war with. You can talk about Joshua and coming into the promised land and how they were instructed to wipe everybody out of the promised land. These nations were sacrificed so that Israel could become Israel, so that ultimately Christ could be born through that line, so that we would have salvation. So, I'm sure everybody in here knows who the Sabians were, right? The Sabians. And no, not some powerful coach from Alabama. No, actually, they were from the ancient kingdom of Sheba in South Arabia. And they tied their lineage all the way back to Shem. So that tells you where their history comes from. They were known for having extreme wealth. And that wealth dealt in spices, gold, and slaves, including Jewish slaves. So that's where they come from. There are references back to Solomon when the Queen of Sheba brought gifts to Solomon. Their history is documented very well through the Old Testament. And that's who they were. I had to look it up because when I saw that term, I go, huh? Who? So, all right.
Looking at verse 2 makes me think of baptism.
When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Yeah.
Referencing when they crossed the Red Sea and then when they crossed the river.
Yeah. We could get off on well into a rabbit hole on that, and I agree with you completely. I think there are so many illustrations that come through here that help us understand why baptism, why burial in water. If we just take the scales off and see. And yes, this is one of them without a doubt. Without a doubt.
I think there's a repeat.
Say what?
I think it's in Psalms that there's a repeat of that because I have it hanging on my mirror at home.
Yeah.
Isn't it in Psalms?
This concept of passing through the water occurs many times. And yeah, I think it comes all the way back to the Red Sea being parted and, yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yemen? Okay, that gives you all a geographical reference.
I have no idea what Yemen is.
Yemen is a country in Arabia, southern Arabia. It's not a huge country. It's a fairly small country. If I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me correctly, that some of the terrorists involved in 9/11 came from Yemen. So, yeah. So. Oh, okay, so much for that sidetrack. Okay. Verse 4, since you are precious in my sight, since you are honored and I love you, I will give other men in your place and other people in exchange for your life. If you just read that, whoa, what's that sound like? Okay. referring to the Jews, though. Sounds like the Jews knew what they were doing, huh? But you have to look at the context there of the terminology that's being used. The sense probably refers to from that time, not because of their actions, which would make a whole lot more sense given the recordings we have of the actions of the Israelites. A couple of translators have rendered it because, and that's why some of your versions, it's going to say because of. So. Verse 4, since you are precious in my sight, since you are honored and I love you. Okay, the context probably means more from that time, that from the beginnings that God named them is kind of the context that's there. Because they certainly were, for the vast majority of the time, not an honorable people. So.
But they were always precious to God.
Yeah, because he chose them. Yeah. Go to Revelation 3. Thought this was an interesting cross-reference. Okay, this is the Apostle John transcribing that which was revealed to him, that the Spirit allowed John to reveal. And so we look at 3, verse 9. Look at those who belong to the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews but are liars instead. I will make them come and bow down at your feet, and they will know that I love you. Okay. Who was Revelation written to? To the church. No. They would know that I will love you, the church. So that's why I thought it was an interesting cross-reference. Something for y'all to ponder on when you're mowing the yard and you got stuff running through your mind. Okay, now let's flip back the other way. Exodus 19. We have a couple verses in Exodus 19. Before I pull this out, Exodus goes back to what time frame?
When the Jews were in Egypt.
When they were and they left Egypt, right? Okay. Hence the name Exodus.
Yeah.
Okay, which involved the crossing of the Red Sea. Okay, so I want you to keep all that context in mind as we're looking at this. Verses 5 and 6. Now, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession out of all the nations, for the whole earth is mine. And unto me you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you are to speak to the Israelites. Okay, so obviously that was words that went to Moses, that he was to speak to the Israelites. That the Israelites were to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. But the more powerful one to me is verse 5. For the whole earth is mine. He says it many times. And he says it many times. Yep. Yep. Yeah, I pulled this straight out. I didn't go back and pull the whole verse. So, yeah. I want to read Barnes' commentary on this section right here because I thought it was an interesting commentary. Since you were precious in my sight, this verse contains another reason why God would defend and deliver The reason was that he had loved them as his people, and he was willing, therefore, that other people should be overcome in order that they might be saved. Thou hast been honorable. This does not refer so much to their personal character as to the fact that they had been honored by him with being the depository of the precious truths of his religion. It means that he had made them honorable by the favors bestowed on them, not that they were honorable in reference to their own personal character and worth. Therefore I will give men for thee, as in the case of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Seba. He would cause other nations to be destroyed if it were necessary, in order to effect their deliverance and restore them to their own land. And from this verse right here, we learn a few things, and this still is according to Barnes. That nations and armies are in the hand of God and at his disposal. That his people, this one we need to remember, that his people are dear to his heart and that it is his purpose to defend them. That the revolutions among nations, the rise of one empire and the fall of another are often in order to promote the welfare of his church, to defend it in danger and deliver it in time of calamity. And I think that's something else we probably should remember. And that his people should put the utmost confidence in God as being able to defend them and having formed a purpose to preserve them and save them. Okay, and expressions similar to this occur frequently among the Arabians, actually. So, I've said before, take commentators in with a grain of salt, but I thought that that was a very powerful and a very accurate representation of this passage, and some really good extensions of what we should be paying attention to, including nations rise and nations fall, and why they do. Okay. All right. Any comments? Verses 5 and 6. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bring your offspring from the east and gather you from the west. And I will say to the north, give them up, and to the south, do not hold them back. Bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth. Okay. What do you think he's talking about here? Keep in mind now that what remains of all of Israel at this point in time? Only Jerusalem, where Isaiah is at, right? Okay, so what do you think this is talking about? Isn't Isaiah prophesying that the people will come back together? And they did. Although probably not really the way that I think they expected, but nonetheless. At this point, or by the time that this prophecy is fulfilled, they would have been released from Babylonian captivity, even to the point that slave traders at that point in time would have carried the Jews to the far western isle of Java or Ionia. So by the time that happened, I mean, the Jews were scattered north, south, east, west. And so that's what Isaiah is prophesying, is that they will come back together. And they did, for the purposes of Christ being born and for us to be here today. Verse 7. Everyone who is called by my name and whom I have created for my glory, whom I have formed, even whom I have made. I'm beginning to think that if you go to Bible Hub and you type in like Isaiah 42:3, whatever meaning, there's usually one that pops up and it says pulpit commentary. And I'm beginning to think the pulpit commentary is actually Clark's, because this time I happened to see some really close language that was almost mimicked it. So, everyone that is called by my name, the very name of Israel, meant the Prince of God or the soldier of God. I did not know that that's what Israel meant, so I thought that was interesting. And thus, every Israelite was called by God's name. According to this commentator, the very name of Israel meant Prince of God or soldier of God. So it could mean soldier of God. Fought with, okay. A soldier of God. Yeah. Okay. So this guy's not off base when he says meaning a soldier of God. And thus every Israelite was called by God's name, El. Israelites were also known among the nation as Jehovah worshipers. I have created, formed, made him. The three verbs describe the process of formation from the first rough cutting to the perfecting of the work. The third verb would perhaps be best translated, I have perfected or I have completed him. All three acts, creation, formation, and completion, are done by God for his own glory. Turn to Proverbs 16. Beginning in verse 3. Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be achieved. The Lord has made everything for his purpose, even the wicked for the day of disaster. Everyone who is proud in heart is detestable to the Lord. Be assured that he will not go unpunished. Flip to Romans now. Okay, we know Proverbs was written by Solomon, and we know Solomon lived well before Isaiah. So Isaiah obviously had to be thinking in terms of Solomon's writings for his thought process. But now we have it on the other side, because Paul in Romans 11, verse 36, passage that is probably well known to all of us. For of him and through him and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Paul was obviously echoing the same thought process from Isaiah, and probably all the way back to Solomon and the Proverbs. And then the last reference I have in here is back to Revelation. Other than condemnation, what is the other prevailing theme of Revelation? Yes. But that wasn't the word I was looking for. But yes, that is, yes. Yeah. Don't worry about it. We already won. Yeah. Isn't it praise? If you're going to put one word on Revelation besides the condemnation, wouldn't it be the praise that's involved in there? Yeah. And so Revelation 4:11, we see some of that. Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. So this thought process that we see here in 43 goes all the way through the scriptures, which is interesting. If you really look at that whole piece, that whole timeline, it all comes back together. So. I think we're going to stop there, because the rest of the chapter really tie one thought together. So I think we'll hold there. Any last comments? Hopefully I gave you all something to ponder throughout the week. When you're sitting there having that first cup of coffee in the morning, or Diet Coke, whatever. Or like, I don't know about y'all, but when I mow the yard, I've got 10 million things running through my mind at all times. So.
I drink Kool-Aid, so that's my thing.
Edward, would you close?
Let's pray. Holy Father, thank you for this time we can come and study and
Amen. And thank y'all.